Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ralph K. Hawkins, and today we're going to be discussing his book titled Discovering Exodus Content, Interpretation, Reception. Last time we discussed his book, How Israel Became a People, and today we're going to be continuing a discussion that we had last time about the Exodus. A lot of scholars, most secular scholars, reject that there was an Exodus. They think it never happened. They say there's too great of an absence of evidence. There's not enough evidence. Some will say there's no evidence at all. And some will say that some will question if Moses even existed. Some will go as far as questioning if David or Solomon even existed later on. So, Dr. Hawkins, welcome back to the podcast. And my first question is, how do you deal with the criticism from the over scholars that say there's a huge absence of evidence?
Well, thank you for having me back, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be with you. And that's a really great question, that the whole issue of the absence of evidence. And it is true that there is a lack of evidence in large part. The only historical reference in the entire book of Exodus is Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, where it mentions the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses. And so those are the only specific reference. The Pharaoh is never named. There are no references to known events that provide historical synchronisms. So in that respect, it's difficult to establish historical anchors for the events. And of course, that gets into questions of chronology and how we can talk about when an Exodus, if there was an Exodus, when it may have occurred. But the whole issue of the lack of evidence is an issue. And some of that is related to things like, what if there was an Israelite population who departed from Egypt, how big was it? And a literal reading of the scriptures, you could get up to 2, 3, 4 million people if you read the text literally according to the kind of conventional traditional readings. And you can't find evidence for that kind of population traipsing around in the Sinai wilderness archaeologically. So for some people, that's a huge problem. They feel like, if there's not direct evidence for those things, then their faith is at risk, or the events must not have happened. The idea, though, that that you would find massive amounts of remains in the Sinai desert, really that's another topic in and of itself. And I would suggest there are two topics here. One would be, how many Israelites left Egypt. I'm kind of operating under the assumption here that an Exodus did occur, but assuming it did occur, how many Israelites actually left Egypt? And then secondly, what kind of evidence ought we to expect in the wilderness if that population traversed the wilderness? I won't go through the whole argument here. You can find that in the volume, but personally, I think there are very good reasons to scale down the number of those Hebrews who left Egypt. And it goes back to the issue of how we understand the Hebrew word Eleph. If you look that up in a Hebrew dictionary, it's typically translated 1,000. And so when the Bible talks about 30,000 or 50,000, it's in Hebrew. It actually says like 30,000. It'll say 30 Elephim. That's the plural of Eleph, Elephim. So 30 Elephim. what does it mean? Traditionally, again, Aleph has been rendered thousand, but there's been this long series of debates about how to interpret it. And a very famous biblical scholar, he used to teach at the University of Michigan, died just a few years ago, George Mendenhall. He argued that Aleph did not, that at least in some cases, it did not necessarily mean 1,000, but that it could also be translated unit, something like unit. So when the Bible says 30 Elephim, it's not saying 30,000, but it's saying 30 units. And based on analogy, he compared the use of these terms with the Tel El Amarna tablets. And in the Amarna tablets, what happened would be these Canaanite chieftains would write letters to the Pharaoh and say, hey, our town is being attacked by marauders. Could you send could you send 10 Elephim, or could you send what we see in those tablets is that 20 or 30 soldiers would be sent. So Mendenhall speculated that an Aleph could mean a unit of soldiers comprised of something like, I don't remember exactly the number he said, but something like 20 to 40 soldiers. So if we took that interpretation of Elephim and went back to the numbers in Exodus and Numbers and retabulated how many Israelites left Egypt, we'd get something more like so many squads of soldiers that would equal about 5,000 men on foot. And maybe each of those men had a wife and 2 children. That would just be, conservatively speaking, in the ancient Middle East, they probably had 7 children. But anyway, just hypothetically speaking, say we had an exodus of about 5,000 people, maybe adding a little bit for spouses and children. But that's probably a lot more realistic. And some listeners, some scholars might say, well, you're reducing the scale down too far. You're diminishing the inspiration of Scripture or whatever. But I don't think that's true. When you look at the situation in ancient Canaan, estimates based on the carrying capacity of the highland villages suggested there were only around 20 to 50,000 Israelites there in the 12th century BC. And when we get down into the Iron Age 1, we have a population of about 150,000 there. And so, the idea that 6 million people swarm the highlands, it's just not realistic based on what we know about population. So I would say that the size of the Israelite people that left Egypt was much smaller, 5,000-6,000. When you think about what kind of evidence you might look for in the wilderness for such a population, I think here part of the issue is expectation. What would we expect to reasonably find in a desert environment produced by such a population that was transient? They were moving through the wilderness on their way to Canaan. They were not settling down and building cities. And we know that populations that are moving through the desert don't leave a lot of remains behind them. They're not building structures. They may have produced a little bit of pottery, but we know that nomadic populations would typically carry their water not in ceramic vessels, but in skins. So, you're not going to find a lot of broken pottery on the ground. When you look, for example, at the Beni Hassan tomb painting, you'll see that the Asiatics depicted in that painting, who the Beni Hassan tomb painting shows 37 Asiatics who had gone down to Egypt to engage in trade, and they've all got skins draped over their shoulders in which they're carrying their water. So we wouldn't expect to find broken pottery shards behind them. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I'm suggesting that we wouldn't find a lot of archaeological remains left behind by a transient people moving through the desert. This guy named Michael Homan, who wrote a book called To Your Tents, O Israel, just a few years ago. And in that book, he was studying the archaeology of tents and of pastoral nomads to try to figure out what kind of evidence would have been left by their campsites. And he shows how the evidence would have been very minimal, even in the case of some very large-scale historical events. People moving through the desert didn't leave much remains. He cites the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC, where Thutmose III inhabited a tent through a 7-month campaign against Megiddo. But he says there's no evidence of Thutmose III's encampment, no evidence of his siege works, no evidence of the battle itself. None of that has ever been recovered. And then he points to another famous battle, the later Battle of Kadesh, which happened in 1274 BC. And that's where Ramses II led a campaign and inhabited a tent throughout that campaign. And that battle was so famous that it was actually recorded numerous times. I'm going to read to you a little quote from Homan. This is on page 33 of my book. He says, the profound impression made by the battle is evident from the fact that not only are the events of Kadesh captured for posterity epigraphically in 10 different places, but they're artistically depicted on the walls of many Egyptian monuments. Scenes of the battle exist at Abydos, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, and Abu Simbel, while depictions of the Egyptian camp adorn walls at Abu Simbel, Luxor, and twice at the Ramesseum. But despite all the hullabaloo about this battle, no record of it has ever been found. Not a single scrap. There's no evidence of the thousands of soldiers that the texts say there were there. No evidence of Ramses II's encampment have ever been discovered. Even after a century of exploration and excavation, no record. So when temporary things happen in history, whether in the desert or even in more urban situations, these kinds of campaigns based out of tents, they just don't leave much remains. So personally, I would argue that the lack of evidence in the wilderness is not a substantial obstacle. I mean, if we're not going to find any remains from the Battle of Kadesh or the Battle of Megiddo, huge operations that lasted months and months and months, in a concentrated environment, why would we expect a transient population who drank water from skins and were moving on foot through the desert? Why would we expect to find a lot of evidence for them? There is a real important historian named David Hackett Fisher, and he wrote a book several years ago. I've got it on my shelf right over here. It's called Historians' Fallacies. And in that book, he outlines a number of fallacies that historians sometimes fall into when they're doing their historical study. And one of these fallacies that he identifies is the fallacy of non-evidence. And he says that some historians, if they discover that there's no evidence for a historical event, then they may conclude that historical event must not have occurred. But he argues that the non-evidence is exactly that. It's non-evidence. It's not evidence. So he says the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So just because there's no evidence there, it doesn't disprove an event for which there's a textual account. It's simply no evidence at all, right? So that doesn't mean the event didn't occur. So I would argue that the same thing applies in the case of the Israelites who left Egypt and wandered across the Sinai Desert. No, we don't have direct evidence for them, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in that case.
We have a super chat question from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you for your super chat. Is it true Canaan was under Egyptian military control at the time of the Exodus?
Yes, I would. Well, no, I would say that there was a shift that was occurring at the part of the answer to that is going to depend on when you date the Exodus. But I would put the Exodus sometime between about 1279 and I would put it sometime in the latter decades of the 13th century. So sometime between 1292 and 1189, something like that. So I tend to put it around, say, 1280. But if we put it in that time, we do have some texts that tell us about the situation in Canaan that in the decades directly leading up to that time. And these are the Amarna texts, the Tel El Amarna tablets. We have about 307 of these tablets. And these tablets record the correspondence between the Canaanite city-states of Syria-Palestine and Pharaoh Amenephis IV. So he reigned from 1353 to 1337 BC. And these Canaanite city-state chieftains were vassals under Pharaoh Amenephis IV. And so what they would do is they would write letters to the Pharaoh and they would ask him to intervene in local power conflicts and things like that. So what the Tel El Amarna tablets show us is that, yes, Egypt was still viewed as having authority over Canaan, at least in the 14th century BC. So the question is how far down into, the 14th and 13th century does their authority extend? I think that what we see happen, we know that during the years from the end of the late Bronze Age into the beginning of the Iron Age, during that transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, we do see that the late Bronze Age system in the Eastern Mediterranean world began to crumble. And that really began in about 1250 BC with the fall of Troy. And all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world, we see the great empires crumbling and declining. So during that period of the LB Iron I transition, Egypt's domination in Canaan began to wane. And I think from about 1250, 1240 onward, we see their hegemony waning to such a degree that it left a political vacuum, at least in the highlands of Canaan, that created a window of opportunity for new settlement. And I think that's probably why when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, they concentrated their settlements in the highlands, not so much because of remaining Egyptian hegemony, but because of Canaanite populations in the lowlands that they were unable to dislodge. But I would suggest that by the latter decades of the 13th century, Egyptian hegemony had begun to wane.
So you date the Exodus to the 13th century BCE because one of the reasons being it is there that you see that the power in Canaan is shifting from out of control of Egypt.
Right. Yeah. I would tend to date the Exodus to the 13th century. There are two main approaches to the date of the Exodus, and we touched a little bit on this last time we talked. The first date is known as the early date, which tends to date the Exodus to around 1446 BC, whereas the second date, known as the late date, places it sometime between, say, 1280 and 1260, roughly. And there'd be some, debate about I don't know that we can really get too precise within that period. But the early date, the 15th century date, is based primarily on scripture, whereas the late date is based primarily on archaeology. So those who gravitate toward that early date, they base it on a literal reading of 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, which states that Solomon began to build the temple in the 4th year of his reign. And it says that he did it specifically 480 years after the Exodus. Now, thanks to Near Eastern synchronisms, we know that Solomon's 4th year was 966 BC. And when we combine that with the number 480, it takes us back to 1446 BC. That puts us right in the middle of Egypt's 18th dynasty, which ran from 1550 BC down to 1292 BC. So some evangelical scholars, they'll often refer to this approach as the biblical date of the Exodus. And they'll say the biblical date of the Exodus was 1446 BC. But again, as I've pointed out, I think Egypt continued to exercise hegemony over Canaan and Syria through the late Bronze Age down into the latter decades of the 13th century. So I think that the idea that the Israelites could attack vital interests in Canaan when Egypt had hegemony over the country, it just seems unlikely to me. The biblical traditions associated with the conquest, if you read through the book of Joshua and through the book of Judges, they don't reflect clashes with Egypt. So if Egypt still had full hegemony over Canaan during the period of the conquest, we would expect to have that reflected in the books of Joshua and Judges, the Joshua going up against the Egyptians and so on. But that's not reflected in the biblical traditions, nor does the archaeological evidence support a 15th century Israelite emergence in Canaan, either by conquest or peaceful immigration. We just don't have evidence for the influx of a new population in the 15th century BC. So that situation leads me to shift towards a later date scenario, which is based primarily on archaeological data from the 13th century. And the way I see it is that archaeological evidence from the 13th century points to a date for the Exodus sometime during Egypt's 19th dynasty. And that ran from 1292 BC down to 1189 BC. And the kind of evidence that I think we see in the 13th century, we see evidence of the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses. Those are mentioned in Exodus 1:11. And both of those cities have been identified and excavated. The city of Pithom is undergoing renewed excavation even now. Jim Hoffmeyer just recently published an article that provides quite an updated analysis of what's going on there in those excavations. So the supply cities of P. Ramses and Pithom, those both of those sites existed primarily during the 19th dynasty. They were not occupied, didn't exist in the 18th dynasty. Another factor archaeologically that I think points to a 13th century Exodus and conquest that's very, very interesting is that during the 19th dynasty, the Ramesside era, Pharaoh actually had a residence in the city of P. Ramses. So that's kind of interesting. When you read the book of Exodus, it says that in those early chapters when Moses and Aaron were, every other verse, they're going and appearing before Pharaoh and disputing with him and trying to convince him to let God's people go. So it appears that they were able to visit Pharaoh easily and regularly. And the reason for that was he actually had a residence during the 19th dynasty in the Nile Delta. So, which is where the events in the book of Exodus, that's where the slave camp was located in Goshen, and that's the area from which the Exodus was launched. So the fact that Pharaoh resided in Ramses during that period, I think he didn't reside. There was no pharaonic residence in the area in other periods. So that suggests to me a 13th century date. When the Israelites left Egypt and headed out for the Exodus, God told them to avoid the way of the Philistines. That's a reference to a series of stations and forts that had been built as part of a renewal of Egypt's military and administrative presence in northern Sinai. And God says, don't go that way because you'll be captured or you'll be destroyed in war, because the Egyptians are, they're in those forts up and down the way of Horus. Well, we know that military and administrative presence in northern Sinai was revitalized at the beginning of the 19th dynasty. So that also points towards this 13th century date. After the Exodus, after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, Moses sang this song that is featured in Exodus chapter 15, and it's composed in a type of Hebrew known as archaic Hebrew. So it's a poetic piece composed in archaic Hebrew, and most scholars agree that it dates to sometime between the 13th and 12th centuries BC. So that also suggests the antiquity of the tradition associated with the Exodus. In my view, it substantiates to an Exodus occurring in the 13th century or thereabouts. The form of the Sinai covenant made in Exodus chapter 20, that mirrors the suzerain vassal treaties from the second millennium. Kenneth Kitchen and his colleague Paul Lawrence have written a huge volume in which they compile suzerain vassal covenants from antiquity, and they show exactly what those suzerain vassal covenants contained. And if you open up their volume and compare the late bronze covenants from about 1400 to 1200 BC, they mirror almost identically what we find in Exodus 20 and beyond. So I think that also points towards an Exodus in the 13th century or thereabouts. I've already mentioned the Amarna texts. Those point to continuing Egyptian hegemony down into the 14th century. So an Exodus conquest would have had to occur after that. I've mentioned the crumbling of the late Bronze Age system in the Eastern Mediterranean world. That began to happen in about 1250, so that Egyptian hegemony began to slip away in the final decades of the 13th century. We also have a surge of villages in the highlands of Israel that occurs in the 13th century, beginning in about 1230 BC. Those latter decades, 1230, 1220, down to 1200, we have a huge spike in the population of the highlands, and it clearly represented a new demographic group in the land of Canaan. That surge in population happened so suddenly that it can't be accounted for by natural birth rates. So most scholars agree there was a new population element that had appeared in the highlands. I would suggest that the early Iron Age site on Mount Ebal, which was established in around 1220 BC, 1230 BC, I think that represents the new Israelite ethnos in the highlands. And I think that substantiates a 13th century emergence of Israel and Canaan. And then finally, the Merneptah Stela, which dates to about 1210, that has a hymn in it in which Pharaoh Merneptah claims to have triumphed over Asiatic peoples, including Israel. He says that he went into Canaan, and we know that the Stela commemorates a campaign that he led into Canaan that can be dated to the first few years of Merneptah's reign. I like to just round it off to 1210. Some people date it 1207, 1208, 1209, but let's just say 1210. And he says that he marched into Canaan and vanquished the Israelites. So we know can't be real precise about when exactly they left Egypt and went into Canaan, but we know that by 1210 they were there and they were established in the land of Canaan, and there were a significant enough population that Pharaoh Merneptah thought it was worthwhile to mention that he had vanquished them. Of course, we know he was exaggerating because they went on to develop into a nation and obviously, exist for many, many years. And so he was obviously exaggerating when he said he destroyed them.
We have another super chat question from Conflict and Pegasus again. Thank you for your super chat. Mr. Hawkins, if the Exodus was true, then why didn't the Pharaoh write something to play the event down? Was this not a political disaster and slap in the face of the Pharaoh? No need for some kind of damage control?
Well, that's really a great question that has been asked, and why didn't the Pharaoh acknowledge it? The thing here is that we talked a few minutes ago about the absence of evidence. We actually don't have any clear and indisputable references to Hebrews or Israelites in any Egyptian records. So it's not just that the Exodus is not mentioned. The Hebrews, the Israelites, are never mentioned in Egyptian records. We just don't have ever, even one time, as far as I know, any reference to the Hebrews or the Israelites in any Egyptian records. Why is that? Well, the thing is that when Egyptians referred to their slaves that they had retrieved from Canaan or, let's say, Syria, Palestine, adjacent areas, they would simply refer to all of their West Semitic slaves simply as Asiatics. They would never make any distinctions among the groups, nuancing that some, maybe some who lived in this region went by a different ethnicon, maybe some that lived in this nearby region went by another ethnicon, but the Pharaoh would not make those kinds of distinctions. He lumped them all together and called them Asiatics with no distinction between groups. So this is very typical of the way the Egyptians portrayed all foreigners. They would simply depict foreigners as strangers and generalize any non-Egyptian ethnic group by their by some general term or even by their negative qualities. You think, for example, of how slaveholders in the New World related to their slaves. They never identified them by their specific provinces in Africa, but they simply called them Negroes after the color of their skin. So the way the Egyptians referred to their slaves was the same way. They just generalized, calling them all Asiatics. So that, right off the bat, that explains why we don't have any more specific references. It's not that the Egyptians were trying to hide the fact that the Israelites had been there. They didn't care anything about the Israelites. To them, they were just another, another slave group mixed in the hodgepodge of West Asiatic peoples. Another thing I would say about this, there have never been any inscriptions found that make reference to any of the events in the book of Exodus. No inscriptions. So not only are there no records of Israelites or Hebrews, there's no inscription that's ever been discovered that makes a reference to the Exodus. But if you think about the role of public stela, a stela is a monument typically carved in stone. If you think about the role of a public stela, those were designed to laud the pharaoh and to laud the pharaoh's accomplishments and not highlight any mistakes he had made, right? So a pharaoh wouldn't have commissioned a stela that acknowledged any kind of a failure on his part. We can't find any stela, I don't think, that ever mentions gaffes committed by the pharaoh. They just didn't commission those kinds of things to be made. So when you think about it that way, it really shouldn't be surprising that there's no reference to an Israelite exodus that's ever been found in any ancient Egyptian inscription. So I've said two things so far. Number one, there's no reference to an Israelite or a Hebrew because the Egyptians lumped all slave populations together simply as Asiatics. Number two, there's never been an inscription found, but that makes sense because stela were designed to be laudatory of the pharaoh. A third thing I would say is that not a single clay tablet, not a single papyrus, not even a fragment of a papyrus has ever been found that mentions anything to do with the events in the book of Exodus. But again, think about why. When you think about that, really, it shouldn't be a surprise because there are almost no papyri from dynastic times, and none at all have been found in the eastern Nile Delta where the Bible says the Hebrews dwelt. There's not been a single papyrus found from the eastern Nile Delta. Okay, so it's not that there are no papyri from the eastern Nile Delta that relate to the events in the book of Exodus. There are actually no papyri from the eastern Nile Delta at all that mention anything. Why? It has to do with the climate and the conditions for preservation. Those things have just rotted away. They just don't exist. So the fact that we have a lack of evidence there is not surprising. Or let me say that differently. The fact that we have a lack of evidence for the Exodus, a lack of evidence stemming from clay tablets or papyri or fragments of papyri, that's not surprising because we don't have any clay tablets, any surviving papyri, any fragments of papyri related to anything. But again, because the climate, the conditions, they haven't survived. So again, here it takes me back to David Hackett's Fisher's principle. The use of data, some critical scholars will use data that has not been collected or not found. They'll use that as evidence. But David Hackett Fisher would stress that those things are not evidence and cannot be used. So what we have is simply a lack there, not just of evidence about the Exodus, but of evidence about anything that might be attested in such documents.
We got another super chat question. Anubis Fire, thank you for your super chat. What do you think of the Hebrew patriarchs being borrowed from prominent Egyptians like Amenhotep III being Solomon and other speculative parallels?
Oh, goodness. I don't really have a good answer to that. I guess I don't find those very convincing because, I guess they're based on speculation. There's no documentary support for such theories. So, so I just don't tend to give them much credence. I guess for those who come up with such theories, they probably see the texts as dating to much later periods, and so it maybe for them that leaves the issue open to the idea of the stories being fabricated, and and that they that there were retrojective history, and that the reality was that other things have happened. Other things happened, and the later writers are trying to, massage those stories so that they reflect Israelite ideology and tradition or something. But I don't. I tend to. I would date the. I would say that the texts are comprised of ancient sources, and that they have more antiquity than that and are more reliable. Looks like my screen is frozen or was frozen.
Yeah, your video froze for some reason. And I heard a computer notification, I think, from your end when it happened.
Okay.
Maybe
Looks
you have
like
to turn
is it
off
okay?
the video and turn it back on, I guess.
Is it okay now?
No, it's still frozen.
Okay. I wonder what I should do about that. What do you think I should do, Jacob?
You could try turning off the video, and there should be a button on the bottom called Stop Cam,
Stop
which is the
cam.
camera, and then turn it back on.
Okay, I
See
stopped
what
it.
happens.
Okay.
Nope, it's still frozen. That's strange.
Yeah.
Maybe you could try leave studio and rejoin using the link. He'll be back in a moment. This is to fix his video. But even if we can't fix it, his audio is still clear, so we can just keep going without it if we must. Just wait on him to come back.
Jacob, any better?
Oh, yeah. Your video isn't frozen anymore.
Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know.
No, you're fine. It happens. Well, I guess my question can wait because Constellation Pegasus just super chatted. What's the difference between the Reed Sea and the Dead Sea? Wasn't the crossing at the Reed Sea? I think you meant to spell Red Sea constellation.
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know that I can provide a comprehensive answer to it. But the difference between the Reed Sea and the Dead Sea wasn't the crossing of the Reed Sea. Yeah, in Hebrew it's Yam Suf, and there's some debate about what that means. It's thought that means sea of reeds, and some interpreters have made various arguments that that reeds only grew in certain types of conditions, saltwater, freshwater, various things like this. But in my understanding, those kinds of arguments that would and I'm not real fresh on that. I'd have to look back and check. But people have tried to zero down the geography based on their understanding of whether reeds could grow only in freshwater conditions or saltwater conditions. They'll use that to try to argue that maybe the route of the Exodus was closer to the Mediterranean. It was where the headwaters of in the Nile Delta where it joined up with the Mediterranean, or maybe it was one of the inland lakes like the Great Bitter Lakes. But from what I have read recently, those arguments about the reed don't hold water. It's not a very good pun, but that the reed can grow in either conditions, if I remember right. So that would not necessarily be indicative of whether the crossing took place, say, somewhere in the Delta or at one of the inland lakes. But yeah, the Dead Sea, so the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, people have made all kinds of arguments when the Israelites headed out. What they've wanted to do with arguments about the Reed Sea is they've wanted to argue that essentially the reeds could only grow in these marshy areas, and so what they do is they're looking for a natural explanation for the crossing of the Red Sea. So they'll say that the Israelites just waded across the Yam Suf. It was a shallow, marshy area where these reeds could grow, and therefore the Israelites waded across, and that that is a way of overcoming, the difficulty of believing in a miracle. But again, from what I've seen, the reeds could grow in all kinds of environments. So the crossing could have been one of the larger bodies of water, one of the inland lakes like the Great Bitter Lakes, or someplace else. Of course, the Dead Sea is, way at the southeastern corner of the land of Canaan, where the Jordan River drains down into the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is far removed from the Yam Suf, whatever it was.
So who do you think the Pharaoh of the Exodus was? I think that there are some that argue that it was the first Ramses, and others say it's the second. I think there might have been a couple that said the first one was it, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Well, if we end up putting the Exodus sometime between those years, 1292 to 1189, that, if that was the direction we were to go, then that would limit the possibilities. So in the 19th dynasty, the 19th dynasty goes from 1292 to 1189. So the first few pharaohs there are Ramses the First, 1292 to 12. I just found a typo in this book. That happens. His reign, Ramses the First, his reign ends in 1290, and then Seti the First goes from 1290 to 1279. And then Ramses the Second, 1279 to 1213. So based on the date range that I've given, it would have to be either Seti the First or Ramses the Second. And I would be inclined to identify Seti the First as the Pharaoh of the oppression and Ramses the Second as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And then once the Israelites had left Egypt in the Exodus and wandered in the wilderness and settled in Canaan, then Merneptah came after them in about 1210 and claimed to have conquered them, claimed to have destroyed them, and erected the Merneptah Stela in about 1210. So those would be the pertinent pharaohs in my reconstruction, would be Seti the First, Ramses the Second, and Merneptah. Now, for those who adopt an early date, in 1446, that would put the Exodus during the reign of Thutmose III, who reigned from 1479 to 1425. That's a real common one for those who subscribe to an early date Exodus. Sometimes you'll hear other possibilities explored as well. I can't think of who said this, but I've even heard someone argue that Hatshepsut was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. She reigned 1479 to 1458. So those who come down on the early date will typically gravitate toward Thutmose III, but sometimes they'll go either backwards or forwards, depending. But I'd say Seti the First is the Pharaoh of the oppression, Ramses the Second, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Merneptah comes after the Israelites once they've left.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Last question. Any number on how many soldiers died when the waters collapsed in on them? Disappointing there was no folklore to mark the spot. I'm assuming there was a tragic loss of life. The Egyptians suffered that day.
That's a great question. And offhand, I don't even remember that the Exodus account gives any kind of numbers when it mentions the Egyptian army. I think it just says, let's see, let me just get over here real quick. So let's see, Exodus 14. Let's see, the minds of the, he had his chariot made ready. Oh, here you go. Let's see. This is Exodus 14, verse 6. He had his chariot made ready. So this is after the Israelites had left, and Pharaoh's mind was hardened once again, and he decided to go out after the Israelites. It says he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. So the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. But I think when the waters of the sea came back, let's see what it says. Let's see if it gives any kind of numbers. They went into the sea after them. This is Exodus 14:23. All of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. And then the pursuers were drowned. Let's see, the Egyptians' waters receded and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea. Yeah, so according to those numbers, Exodus 14:7, you've got the 700 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. So picked chariots and all the other chariots. Yeah, so kind of interesting. Who knows what the final tally was? It's something larger than that. Yeah, that's not something I've delved into beyond that, though. It's an interesting question.
So when do you think the conquest of Canaan started?
Well, that's another great question. It's interesting. I'm just thinking about that. You know, part of the reason I'm hesitating is just thinking about the terminology and exactly which angle to discuss. Yeah, I tend to refer to the process of the Israelites coming into the land of Canaan as the Israelite settlement rather than the conquest. But it's not that I have an aversion to the term conquest. I sometimes use that as well. The Israelites came into the land of Canaan and they crossed the Jordan River and they headed inland, and eventually they established settlements up in the highlands. So, there were probably some groups that came in that were not involved with the fighting. They established some encampments in the desert of the eastern Jordan Valley, and fighting forces continued west and attacked various cities and so on. So, so there were those who engaged in conquest. There were others who engaged in trying to establish life in the land of Canaan. So it wasn't a uniform process. We have one of the earliest sites that's connected with the Israelites that's been established in the land of Canaan is the altar on Mount Ebal. And it's mentioned in Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 through 35. And the text there says the way that passage is placed in the book of Joshua, it comes after the battle at Jericho and the battle at Ai. And the text says that they went up to Mount Ebal and erected an altar and essentially renewed the covenant with Yahweh as they sought to establish themselves in the land. But according to the excavator, Adam Zertal, the guy who dug the Ebal structure, he dated its founding to 1230 BC. So that's pretty early. And you begin to get other settlements in the highlands, early Israelite villages like Isbet-Sarta, who also date to the latter decades of the 13th century BC. So the Israelites have begun to come into the land and establish sites, erect an altar, establish villages in the latter decades of the 13th century. In terms of, when did they do their fighting and so on, that's an issue because recovering destruction is not always easy. Like at Jericho, there were late Bronze Age walls. Kathleen Kenyon excavated that site, and she found traces of remains from the late Bronze Age, but most of the late Bronze material, most of the late Bronze Age walls at Jericho were eroded away over time. So there's very little that remains, not enough to talk much about when a destruction under Joshua would have occurred there if it actually happened historically. I believe it did, but I don't think it's really recoverable archaeologically. The walls that we have at Jericho now are the Middle Bronze Age walls. So the late Bronze inhabitants of Jericho would have erected the late Bronze Age walls on top of the Middle Bronze Age walls, but those late Bronze Age walls were washed away by erosion, so we don't have them. The situation at the city of Ai was also problematic. The guy who went and excavated there was an archaeologist named Joseph A. Calloway, and he argued that the city he excavated at Ai, there had been a big Middle Bronze Age city there, but he argued the city was uninhabited from the end of the third millennium BC all the way down to about 1000 BC. So he argued that there was no city there for Joshua to conquer. I don't fully agree with him. I think there's some issues there. But the one place where we do have a really nice destruction level is at the city of Hatzor. And we have a beautiful destruction layer there, and it dates to about 1230 BC. So it dates to about the same time as the altar at Mount Ebal. So there's a lot of difficulty in trying to sort through the destruction layers, and even if we identify a destruction archaeologically, it's difficult to prove that the Israelites were responsible for that destruction. But I've probably said far more than you wanted to hear on that. Just in a ballpark answer, I would suggest that the Israelite conquest began in the last few decades of the 13th century. So I would point to the establishment of the altar on Mount Ebal at 1230 as being attestation for the Israelite presence in the land of Canaan during that time, and the destruction at Hatzor as showing that the Israelites were active in engaging cities militarily during that time as well. We also have a destruction layer at Tel Dan, which is up above the headwaters of the Sea of Galilee. And from the book of Judges, it says that the Danites had been unable to dislodge the indigenous inhabitants of the territory that they had been allotted in the book of Joshua. And so in the latter chapters of the book of Judges, they migrated up to above the Sea of Galilee, and they found a city called Laish. We know it from Canaanite. It existed in the previous Canaanite era, and we've got a lot of archaeology from there. But it says that they went to Laish, and they were able to conquer Laish, and they did so, and they changed its name to Dan. But we have a nice destruction layer there that dates to about 1220. So Hatzor is in 1230, Dan is in 1220, Mount Ebal 1230. So this is the period of the Israelite conquest, these last few decades of the 13th century BC.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for that big super chat. Last one again, Mr. Hawkins. With all of the speculation and lack of evidence, plus trying to pin dates on everything, are your thoughts and opinions rock solid today, or is there always a problem to make changes on what you believe happened?
Well, that's a great question. I do stress, this whole issue of the date of the Exodus is it's a controversial issue, and there are some who are very committed to, their views on that. Those who subscribe to the early date tend to be very committed to the early date of the Exodus conquest. Why would they be so committed to it? Well, it's because they have such a high view of Scripture, and they're committed to a literal approach to the reading of Scripture. So they read that number 480 in 1 Kings 6:1, and that they add that to the date of the fourth year of Solomon's reign. They work their way back and get to 1446 BC for the Exodus, and then 1400 for the conquest. So they see that as the biblical date, and they're very, very committed to that. And I have a lot of respect for the folks who hold that view. I have many good friends who hold that view, but some of them we've crossed swords over this in the pages of some journals and in papers. And one paper published several years ago called me a new Wellhausen and said I was trying to tear down the authority of the Bible. That's not true. I'm not working. My goal is not to undermine the Bible. Just because I gravitate toward a late date rather than an early date. For me, it's not ideological. I've come down on the late date because I see I've been influenced by the archaeological data, which I believe points more in that direction. But I stress to my friends and colleagues that if this view is not ideological for me, if I was presented with evidence, especially new evidence that caused me to shift my view, I like to think that I'd be willing to shift my view again, because my position is not an ideological one, but it's just shaped by my current perception of the data. So yeah, I would be open to changing my views. That's one of the things I love about archaeology. As a field archaeologist, we're constantly being faced with new data, presented with new data, and it's constantly revitalizing our view of biblical events, biblical history. In some cases, it's opening up new vistas of biblical history that we did not even know before. The project of which I'm a co-director, the Jordan Valley Excavation Project, we're working in the Jordan Valley in the desert, and we're in the process of uncovering an Iron Age II Israelite city, and it's a fortified city about 5 miles north of Jericho. The Bible never mentions it. So we're literally discovering new, previously unknown history about ancient Israel. So so it's helping us discover new vistas for reconstructing ancient Israelite history. So yeah, I like to think I'm open to revising my view and changing it based on the data.
We got another super chat question from Anubis Fire. Thank you for your super chat. Any thoughts about the Canaan conquest being associated with the Bronze Age collapse?
I do think that the conquest of Canaan was made possible by the LB Iron Age 1 transition. Yeah, the collapse of the late bronze Mediterranean system. Again, it caused a shakeup in the Eastern Mediterranean world in the latter decades of the late Bronze Age. And we see, the fall of Troy and the western side of the Mediterranean Sea, and that has a ripple effect that spreads east. We see many of the old city-state systems beginning to collapse. The Hittite Empire begins to crumble during this period, and Egypt begins to lose its grip on Canaan as well. So yeah, the late Bronze Age, the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, it led to a period of population shakeup populations were on the move. People headed out from Troy when it collapsed and began to, look for a new home. During that period, 7 tribes of sea peoples left the Western Mediterranean and headed east. One of these we know from the Bible. Well, we know the names of all 7 tribes, but only one survived in the biblical period. That was the tribe of the Philistines. But these 7 groups of sea peoples headed east, and some of them attacked Egypt and tried to gain a foothold there. Egypt rebuffed them and scattered them up along the Canaanite coast. And initially, presumably, there were multiple of these 7 tribes there, but eventually only the Philistines survived, and of course they eventually died out as well. But yeah, definitely, I think the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, the Eastern Mediterranean system was shaken up. Populations were on the move, lots of transients, people moving around. And as Egypt lost its grip on Canaan, it kind of created a political vacuum into which the incoming Israelites were able to, to come into the land of Canaan. That political vacuum also provided the opportunity for the Philistines to come in. From the Israelites, according to the Bible, were coming in from the east and migrating west, and the Philistines, on the other hand, were coming from the Western Mediterranean and migrating east. So not exactly at the same time, but with a little bit of overlap. But yeah, so that the late Bronze Age collapse definitely opened the door to new settlement in Canaan.
How does the New Testament assist in understanding the Exodus? That is what the Gospels and Acts, for example, say about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that they all, I mean, the Exodus has a huge, it has a huge, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. The Exodus was such a major event in ancient Israel's history that, you think of like throwing a boulder into a pond. I mean, it just huge waves that went out, and those waves change into ripples, and they continue to radiate out, so that the Exodus essentially permeates all of Scripture. From the book of Exodus all the way to the end, to the book of Revelation. And one of the chapters in the book is about echoes of Exodus in the New Testament. And it's not exhaustive, but I try to trace out some of the major ways that the Exodus reverberates throughout the New Testament. And it's certainly there, in all of the Gospels, and it's there in Acts, and it's there through the epistles, all the way down into the book of Revelation. Just thinking about one of the major authors of the New Testament was Luke. When you think about the percentage of Scripture that he wrote, he was the author of both the Gospel of Luke and the sequel, the book of Acts. So when you take Luke, Acts together, that represents one of the most substantial units of Scripture in the New Testament. It puts Luke as one of the major, one of the leading authors of New Testament material. And I would just mention in Luke, you think about the his sequel to the Gospel in the book of Acts. He shows one of his major themes is the early Christian community as a new temple movement, and this theme in Luke mirrors the building of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. So, in Exodus, after he defeated Pharaoh and Pharaoh's forces, Moses led the Israelites out to Mount Sinai, where they entered into a covenant relationship with God. And once that covenant relationship was ratified, He then built the tabernacle so that the Lord could once again dwell in the midst of the people. Well, after its completion, the tabernacle was then filled with God's glory, visibly present in the form of a great cloud. So that's the story in the book of Exodus. In Luke's story, he portrays Jesus as the prophet like Moses, and his story, the prophet like Moses, follows the same pattern. Jesus defeated the forces of Satan, and he sealed the new covenant with the people. And then after he had done that, he erected the sanctuary. Luke had already recorded in his gospel how the temple of the new covenant was raised up, and that Jesus himself was that temple. And then when you get into the book of Acts, in the Pentecost event, similar to the way that a cloud covered the tabernacle, when the glory of the Lord filled it, tongues of fire rested on the heads of the apostles who had gathered in Jerusalem. And that early community was filled with the Shekinah, just like the tabernacle had been. And the community itself became the new tabernacle, or the new temple of God. So the victory of the prophet like Moses and his establishment of his new temple community, his erection of the new temple, it all is built on or modeled after the story of the erection of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. So yeah, I think Luke was trying to stylize the birth of the church, or the birth of the new temple movement, as a parallel to Moses and his erection of the tabernacle. Some other really key things in the book of Acts that draw on the revelation provided in the book of Exodus. You think, for example, one of them would be how early Christian leaders in the book of Acts, they refer to Jesus as the Kyrios, which is usually translated Lord. That term Kyrios was used by Palestinian Jews in the last pre-Christian centuries as a substitute for the tetragrammaton, the divine name in the Old Testament, the tetragrammaton, meaning the four letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, YHWH, which most scholars today would suggest should be pronounced Yahweh. But for example, in Peter's Pentecost speech, so that's the very first Christian sermon, right? If you go back and read that very first Christian sermon, Peter applied the term Kyrios to the risen Christ. And that was hugely significant, again, because that's the term Palestinian Jews used to refer to the tetragrammaton. So by applying that term Kyrios to Jesus, he was claiming that the risen Christ was equal to Yahweh. So hugely, hugely significant. He's taking that divine name revealed to Moses in Exodus 3, 14, and 15 and applying it to Jesus. So there are other things we could talk about, but, another thing in Peter's Pentecost sermon, he uses the term Messiah for Jesus. Now, that's not a term that's used in the book of Exodus, but when you get into the later Old Testament prophets, there is a motif that is used in the prophets called the New Exodus motif, or the New Exodus theme. And Isaiah is a big one for this. Isaiah talks a lot about the New Exodus motif. And when he talks about the New Exodus motif, he says it will be led by a messianic figure. So the New Exodus will be led by a New Exodus figure. So when Peter gave that first Christian sermon, he talked about the Messiah, and he said that the Messiah was the prophet like Moses that had been predicted in the Pentateuch. So he's specifically pinning the identity of the Isaianic Messiah who would lead the new Exodus. he's pinning that identity on Jesus and saying Jesus is the messianic figure who would lead this new exodus out of bondage, out of sin, into a reconstituted Israel. So yeah, almost every book in the New Testament draws on Exodus and has echoes of Exodus throughout.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and your audience asks such great questions.
Yeah, they really do. They really do ask great questions. Well, thanks again, Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you all.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.